Okay, so here let us first talk about what is the impact of the demand or the supply shock on the economy. So if you remember, in the last video we said that the objective of the economy was to move from any short run equilibrium to a long run equilibrium, right? So that means the objective of the economy is to remove any output gap, whether it is recessionary gap or it is inflationary gap. That's the objective of the economy, and the economy can satisfy its objective by the shift of the AD or the SRAS. That means the objective of the economy to remove the output gap is achieved by a positive or a negative shock to the economy, either a positive or negative demand shock or a positive or a negative supply shock, depending on the situation. And we said that if the economy has to remove the recessionary gap, then it needs a positive shock, and if the economy has to remove an inflationary gap, then it needs a negative shock. Okay. Now here I have laid out for you the different shocks to the economy. Your number 1 is a positive demand shock. Your number 2 is a negative demand shock. Your number 3 is a positive supply shock, and number 4 is a negative supply shock. Okay. So that means these two, 1 and 2, are the demand shocks as you have there. 3 and 4 are the supply shocks that you have there, right? Or in other words, 1 and 3 are showing you the demand shocks to the economy. 2 and 4 are showing you the negative shocks to the economy. So that means you would need something like 1 or 3 to remove a recessionary gap, and you would need something like 2 or 4 to remove an inflationary gap. But let us first walk through what do these shocks really do to the economy. So let us say that initially our equilibrium is at this point, and the demand curve is AD and the short run aggregate supply is SRAS. If there is a positive demand shock to the economy, then the demand curve shifts right to something like AD dash, and as a result of that you have an increase in real GDP and an increase in price index. So that's the impact on the economy. So you have growth on one side and you also have inflation on the other side. Well, growth is always desirable, but inflation may not be desirable. So it leads to one desirable impact and one relatively undesirable impact on the economy. Okay. Now let's go on to negative demand shock. The same thing. Let's say the economy is at this point originally, and if there is a negative demand shock such that the demand curve shifts left to something like AD dash, then as a result of that the economy would experience a decrease in real GDP along with a decrease in the price index. So the real GDP would go down, which means there is stagnation, and there is a decrease in price index, so there is deflation. Well, deflation is a desirable thing for the economy, but stagnation is not a desirable thing for the economy. So you can see that the demand shocks always lead to one desirable thing and another relatively undesirable thing for the economy. Let's go on to the supply shocks. Same thing, we have a positive supply shock here, we have a negative supply shock there. So let us say that the economy is originally at this point. If there is a positive supply shock due to those supply shifters that we have discussed in previous videos, such that the supply curve moves to the right, the SRAS has gone up, so you experience a new equilibrium in the economy where your real GDP goes up and your price index goes down. So there is growth and at the same time there is deflation. So you can see both good things are happening in the economy, both desirable things happening in the economy. Similarly, if there was a negative supply shock such that the SRAS curve was shifting leftward, this being the original point, if it goes in the leftward direction, you have a new equilibrium here so that your real GDP goes down and your price index goes up. So due to a negative supply shock, you have stagnation as well as inflation. So two bad things, two undesirable impact on the economy at the same time. So you can see due to a demand shock, there is one good thing, one desirable thing and one relatively undesirable thing. But on the supply side, it is either all good or it is all bad. Now please note that if there is stagnation and inflation in the economy happening at the same time, this is also known as stagflation. And it is the worst impact possible on the economy, because on one hand your economy is stagnating and on the other side the prices in the economy are rising high. This is very high level of inflation, something like hyperinflation, similar to what happened in Venezuela or what happened in Zimbabwe. We are talking about situations like that. No growth, and at the same time the prices are rising. So stagnation and inflation happening together, which is together called stagflation. Please note that stagflation can only be caused by this negative supply shock to the economy and no other kind of shock. And that's the reason that the negative supply shock is the worst kind of shock to an economy. Now in the next video, we will see how the adjustment of the economy from any short-run equilibrium to the long-run equilibrium takes place. In other words, how is the recessionary or inflationary gap removed from an economy.